June 16, 1976, had the Soweto uprising, a series of demonstrations and protests led by Black school children in South Africa. Since then, there have been commemorations of June 16 around the continent as there are shared struggles for independence, for self-determination, and for ensuring that all Africans can be liberated from the claws of colonialism and apartheid. In conversation, I'm having a chat with a fantastic woman human rights defender, Masana, and we will be unpacking and trying to understand some of these experiences, the history, and the current trends or crises that we're experiencing and seeing in the world today. Masana, thank you very much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Thanks, Dumi, and I'm really grateful to be able to be part of this conversation with you. I think this conversation is very telling at this moment of crisis, and we keep saying more needs to be done, but whose bodies are doing that more, and how have they been made visible or invisible? So I'm excited. I'm excited to be here with you.
Aside from the flavor within our context, being at home and trying to be as safe as possible, I think it's really quite critical for us to, then have that conversation around, what then should be visible and what then should be allowable. How should we be framing things? What kind of language should we be using within the context of our struggles? And I think, as you were speaking in my head, I was reminded of how, the audience often, especially in civil society, is for a certain demographic that holds power. And it's to make sure that that is acceptable for them, whether it's in a grant application, that it's acceptable and palatable to media. When we're seeing how, especially what's unraveling in the US with the protests over Black Lives Matter, and how a lot of people will try and maybe conflate or maybe just speak about, oh, all lives matter and so forth. But this isn't like unique to this trend. We've seen it with the Me Too movement. We've seen it with the Arab Spring. So what do you think is really important in terms of, safeguarding visibility of those who are outliers, those who are most vulnerable, those who are marginalized within the context of social justice?
Yeah, and I've grappled with this question a lot. I'm a single parent to a very feisty, a very alive young Black child. And within this context, I've been thinking about how do I speak to her, not just about our pre-colonial lives and the inherent value of our Blackness and our gender identities, but also the inherent value of what we bring to the world and the violence with which that's met. So we see this extensive violence. And I think moments like this with the police brutality that we're seeing in the US, which has been rampant and really itself is a pandemic, are also very much aligned to the use of police force and brutality on certain bodies and lives within the African continent itself. So this disproportionate relationship to police and to authorities, and often in these instances, it is the lives that don't fit within the binaries, that aren't cisgender or heterosexual, that aren't predominantly closer to whiteness or white capital. So the departure from, the further away you move from white capital, white cisgender heterosexual capital, the more likely you are to experience pandemic violence, starting from your moment of conception, right, to your very last breath. And this violence isn't just articulated on your body physically through your interaction through state authorities, but also within the home dynamic, the visible and invisible unpaid care work that is done extensively throughout the continent, the fight to stay alive, to be valid, to make a contribution into the very matters that affect your life. And so for me, when I'm an economist by training, when I think a lot about inequality, there's been this obsession, particularly with donors around inequality, with, again, making it a conversation about poverty and disenfranchisement, looking at those who are furthest away from the center, those who are forced to live on the margins as those who are in need of intervention, right? Those who are in need of the philanthropy and the kind-heartedness of this donor conception of the world. But when we move away from that poverty marginalization conversation and then look as well at Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the poor, also then look at the upper echelons of power, then inequality studies, at least from a socioeconomic perspective, forces us also to examine how wealth and power have been so acutely accumulated by a minority and how they use that power to subjugate. So the violence that we're seeing with regards to George Floyd, for example, is not fundamentally different from the violence of colonial systems that benefited from creating those structures. And once we shift our focus again from these minor instances and look as well at the United States as a critical actor in the global political economy at enforcing these types of dynamics, is when we begin to highlight that it's not just about police brutality, it's about systemic violence. And it's not that as those who are further from the margins are necessarily without power or without influence. Instead, we see through the mass mobilizations of the past year, the leadings of the feminist movement, the pride movements in the continent that were held for the first time, the movements against austerity across the world. Instead, we see that people have power, and actually capital cannot function without people. And as we begin to consolidate that power and that mass mobilization, perhaps then we bring back into visibility ourselves. So we look at ourselves as visible, and validate for ourselves the work that we've done. And I think that's how we've always organized. It's just that now the stakes are higher for those who have insurmountable amounts of wealth.
Yeah. And I love, how you framed so many of these issues. Like in my head, if we were in a conference, I'd be clicking and I'd be like waving my hands, like, yes. So, I mean, like, it's really powerful the fact that, especially when bringing in the conversation about power and how, it's really not necessarily about the incident. It's not necessarily about, documenting. And, as you're speaking, I was visualizing that photo that, is widely, globally known of Hector Peterson having been shot. And and I was just sort of thinking to myself that it's always interesting how when we speak about violence we never speak about economic implications. I mean, yes, conversations are starting to emerge around the psychological context, the triggers that we experience, especially for survivors who then get to a point where they try and affirm their reality through organizing, and they still have to battle certain microaggressions and certain variants of violence that don't necessarily that aren't necessarily considered illegal, and they aren't necessarily considered as I guess palatable, to certain demographics. And so then that leaves me now to then really question, why is it that, when you've got economic backing, when you have institutional power, when you have resources, and we're seeing it, especially in strategic litigation, that, when you're led by a consortium of partners that are working on a certain, whether it's criminalization of certain bodies or whether it's a certain level of policing where, an administrative, decision was made, as per in Uganda, for instance, when, several individuals were arrested, or even just looking at our own gender marker cases, in terms of, people being allowed to change their gender markers on the national identity cards. It takes significant economic resources. And now, within the context of all these systems that we're facing, economic I guess maybe, or let's say, assets or equity is really quite critical to effecting change. And that wouldn't have been possible when we're looking at apartheid, for instance. That wouldn't have been possible if there were no economic justifications for a lot of post-colonial liberation dispensations. So why do you think that, in this capitalist, very heavily monetary, war funded world, why do you think that it's still acceptable to not empower, strengthen, or equitably influence activists who are on the ground, the movements that need bailout funds as per the US currently? Why is it not that people can move beyond, the prescribed 6% minimum of returns that they've invested in capital markets? Why are they not deploying the resources that are actually sitting in variant extractive and exploitative markets? Why are they not channeling that to the communities that need it?
Ooh, Yes, that is a whole word of a question. That's a whole church. I mean, I'm not a churchgoer or a believer, but for me, that is a whole church that I would go to, just even trying to unpack that. And I have maybe two reference points that I want to bring up. The first is, and these are, Black women scholars or intellectuals in the
Yeah.
continent who I think also need visibility and citation, because of course in
Yes.
this world of Eurasia, we're always citing the Oxfam reports and not
Yes.
citing the implementers. So the one is Nomfundo Mogapi from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And I'm going to speak to civil society because that's my context. And she says, oftentimes, and I think this is particularly true for bigger organizations, I can't speak for all international organizations, but the very thing that we're trying to address externally, the very social justice issue we try and address externally, then becomes the social ill that we implement internally. So we find ourselves in this vicious cycle of extraction and expropriation, and really capitalization of the people, the humans. They become commodities. They become workers who are meant to be performing and reviewing and always delivering, right? They're not full humans. And then secondly, I want to quote Leno Some, who's a wonderful political economist in Nairobi, actually, who writes about social reproduction and how oftentimes within the capitalist system, the departure from this, white cisgender heterosexual man is ranked in value in terms of how much it can produce. So you are valued for your production and not for your humanity. And so in that social reproduction, the further away you move from that, and particularly, I identify as queer as well within this context, and I see this, in my own world of work, not just with my current employer, but continuously, that I am of less value the further away I move from being able to provide some sort of capital to influential stakeholders. For donors, this capital might look like being considered a progressive human rights organization or funder. Looks like for large NGO being able to say we work closely with grassroots organizations, that sort of emphasis on production rather than humanity then becomes the point of departure. And I think this is where the crisis is that because our donors are working within a capitalist economic system, they view everything as a cost-benefit analysis. So every action you take must have a considered cost, right? Without any consideration for the cost that it would have for a grassroots or a youth organization or an LGBT organization to get things like registration, to then be able to provide an audit, to then, I know Difford at a time was talking about value for product, like the value add of the project. So everything then becomes conceptualized in these economic terms, right? And it's hard, I think, for organizations to then, in looking at their partnerships and their memberships, to remember that actually we're not working within a value add framework, we're working within a social justice framework. And even the conception of human rights, the minimum core human rights that people need, water, housing, those are the minimum things that people need to stay alive, right? To have breath in their lungs. But that's not a full life. And moving away from the cost benefit analysis to the social justice analysis now means that we're talking about not the minimum human rights core, not the cost benefit analysis, but what is a meaningful life that one can live? What is a meaningful partnership that can dismantle power relations? What does equitable power relations look like? And I think there's not enough accountability for that. And there's also not enough acknowledgement of failure, right, for organizations that are in this field to say we're failing. We need to be held accountable. We need to move away from capturing our labor, our memberships as sort of economic indicators in that way. And we can't do this without rethinking systemic economics as a whole. The revolution is not a civic space revolution. It's not a gender-based violence revolution. It's not, it's a systems revolution. It's a revolution on which life has value and how we define that, right? And the further away we move from that capitalist man is where we find then the resistance that I think is building if it's not killed too soon.
Yeah, and that's powerful. I think, about 2 years ago, I started saying, existence is resistance, and that it's such a huge threat for
Mm,
individuals who have power. It's such a huge threat for individuals who can deploy resources for just other bodies to exist, and that there's
mm,
a consistent need to want to police them. And then, in looking in the context of, the AU heads of states theme for this year in silencing the guns,
mm, mm,
I now sit down and really ask myself, what should that then really what should that then truly look like if the systems that we've inherited basically in post-colonial dispensation are
mm,
those that the elite were obviously benefiting from. So now we're finding those who govern obviously have just merely changed color. If
mm,
anything, the processes, the controls, similar as per philanthropy, especially when we're sitting and talking about, like rapid response mechanisms, where it's
mm,
still maybe exclusive to, existing partners or those who had links or networks to other individuals. And then,
mm,
there's also this eligibility around, okay, you need to be an outlier and you need to be most vulnerable, but then you're touching on issues of registration, you're touching on issues of audit, which then comes with a whole lot of institutional, I guess,
mm,
foundations that aren't existing in grassroots organizations. And then they have to somewhat formulate or structure themselves in a way that obviously meets the very capitalist framing of boards and governance and so forth.
mm,
But meanwhile, you're talking about individuals who are probably applying for $5,000. You're talking about individuals who've had operational budgets that are less than $10,000. And they're now having to finally be visible, one, on top of a lot of great work that they've been doing, whether it's, 6, 7 years, in now being noticed and now being acknowledged and affirmed, and, finally qualifying and being eligible. But then we're realizing that there's a gradual shift, because even when you sit and talk about participatory means of governance or engagement, the majority still rules, right? And you might find maybe in an instance where there are, well-established activists, they still largely determine, then who's the one that gets because it's participatory. But then whose story is then invalidated when people who are far away from some of the realities that, on the ground experiences, for instance, just something as simple as having medical aid would make one blind to the social determinants that of the grave shortcomings in universal health coverage. And so I think, COVID-19 has obviously illuminated a lot of those issues. But now in trying to, let's say, establish a future that's a lot more feminist, and trying to establish a post-COVID reality, we're realizing, this systemic revolution needs to either look a certain way, but then also it must sound, also it must adapt, and also it must be relevant. It needs to be decolonized. And now my challenge, to you is, how do you think that these big institutions that cannot move, that are immobile, that, where we believe that, governance is ideal with sound democratic institutions, we're still finding presidencies that are abhorrent, that are toxic, and that are really very disgusting as individuals. And they're still very palatable to a significant majority. Whether you want to call it the religious right, whether you want to call it the nationalists, or these populist influences, I think there's still a lot of systemic ideologies and systems that are obviously clearly still benefiting the few, even though maybe the faces have changed and maybe what that privilege looks like has changed. So how then do we become more feminist in our future? How do we then create a reality despite the limited resources that exist today? How do we create a reality for ourselves that not only affirms, but moves beyond equality and goes towards equity, and moves beyond, deciding and ruling, and allowing for community structures to actually participate in governance, to participate in the determination and the achievement of the Decade of Action, of Africa's Agenda 2063, of silencing the guns, and some of these other, I guess maybe structural policy or legislative instruments. How do we create a more feminist future with this, like, very complex and obviously very difficult landscape to navigate as activists?
Wow, so you're giving me all of the easy questions, I see. It's like you just asked me to solve, centuries old crises for just feminist movements. I think specifically the Black feminist movement. I would. I just want to start with a disclaimer because I really believe in shared knowledge and acknowledging my own areas of growth. Is I don't actually know. I don't have all of the answers, but I have been giving extensive thought to this. And so, whilst I might give an unsatisfactory answer, I also welcome, I think, even you and everyone who engages with this content to challenge me because I'm welcome to being challenged, which is, I think, also for me, part of the feminist revolution is. A lot of the big men in the African continent who do this policy work, who, for example, make the decisions around the African Commission and what that should look like and where that should be held, are not actually open to critique. And they claim to be building democracies, but they want to build their version of a future. So here's where I take as my point of departure. I'm currently part of this game on Facebook, which is an amazing game run by two queer filmmakers based in Cape Town. And I think it's important to state that they're queer, again, because of that erasure that we face extensively. Kelly Ann Koopman and Sarah Frank Summers. And they have created this online game that is led by this fictional figure called the Monopoly Man. And it starts with its point of departure as the current pandemic and the different responses we've seen to that. And this Monopoly Man says benignly to all of the players in the game, there are about 7 of us, I'm going to give you permission to imagine any world possible. And in that world, you can decide whatever you want. And we see sort of different ranges of responses from the players. The one is a deeply spiritual reflection, calling on our Khoi and our African ancestors, not just ancestors, to provide an ethical and ethereal knowledge that is grounded beyond the sort of peer review mechanisms of thinking about the future. And you see in several of the responses that a lot of the players are reflecting on what should be done at the mercy of this capitalist man, as if he is indestructible, right? He is beyond reproach. You cannot touch him. You have to work within his paradigm. So for me, that response from the first player was really powerful in centering and foregrounding that actually we can tap into new systems of knowledge, right? So Donna Summers always talks about the world. These are all women of color that I'm quoting, African women of color. The Anthropocene, right? This beyond growth, this food-led economy that thrives and finds its value and its assessment in access to food, right? I think for me, in my thinking, in my response to the capitalist man, is actually we don't want to work within your system anymore. Why should we work within a system that is built on financialization of our bodies? Why should we respond to your economics and your conception of democracy as if there are no other imaginations about what the world could be? And there's a large group of feminist and queer economists who write about not just unpaid care work, but imagining a world beyond growth. A lot of my work around a post-growth economy is around imagining that we are full humans, right? That we're not just workers in this world. And so that for me, and it's because I take from departure this world of economics and its impact on, for example, Rwanda as being the so-called miracle child, really regressive civic space that we're facing, right? And yet we know for a fact that Rwanda's growth is built on extraction in DRC and violence in DRC, but also the subjugation of civic space and the rights of minorities, including LGBTI activists and dissidents within the country, political dissidents and opposition parties. And is that the growth we want? Is that the the livelihood we want. Why would we want an economy that doesn't work for us, that is filtered into our public and health infrastructure, that is filtered into our system? And looking particularly at the youth movements where, we're sold this lie that education is the answer. The children need education, the youth need education, they need university, they need to be assimilated into this economic system that is extractive of their human essence. But rather, actually, their mobilization across the continent shows us that what is needed is not education around their realities. They know their realities. There needs to be a new conception of a life-giving economy, an economy that is built on the core measurement of not growth, but social justice and equity, just like you said.
That is so powerful. I mean, and I think just from the beginning of your answer and just, acknowledge, I need to thank you because not a lot of people will be able to actually say no, but I don't know. And I think, what I've learned about expertise is the fact that you realize that you don't know and that there's a plethora of knowledge out there and that, you're just one power that's a part of that larger intellectual body of work. And that's important to acknowledge. And it's really important to acknowledge, and affirm, just, giving that permission without me having to ask already. I think it's really, really powerful. And, I'm then just reminded, of how, for instance, more recently after Stella Nyanzi was released, and not now, during COVID, but I just love, how she said, how people are saying that, she was reckless, they wanted her to silence herself and to edit her rudeness. And, I literally quote, I am an academic, not a politician. I want the issues flagged out there. And if I lose a few supporters in the process, then perhaps the issues are much more important. And I've then, and taking this back in terms of some of my own experience, I know, and I've come across so many young people who have been considered too radical, who have been considered to, oh, feminist is such a touchy issue, and, we're not really sure within the context of like maybe, whether it's resourcing or whether it's like civic space or whether it's like governance, that would be acceptable or palatable. But I mean, we're seeing, especially with the feminist bailout response, and we're seeing so much work coming around the fact that there's illicit financial flows and the returns that we're getting in terms of the extraction and exploitation of African bodies, resources, and land isn't necessarily, reflecting in ODA. People speak about remittances, but that's already exploitation that's happening, in across the seas. And so, I'm then sort of just reminded, even with Mariam Makeba's words as she was in exile, and how she was speaking about how, wherever the white man hasn't existed or hasn't been, then it's considered that groups don't exist. And it's only after they touch on the land and they're like, oh, and literally this is what she said. She's like, Booth, now you exist, which is ridiculous. And it's true. Because it's only when something is palatable and it's only when something might be acceptable or politically salient, looking at how, there was a shift from, the HIV response to like the wider SRHR. And, even just with climate, how, previously, especially when I look at, some of our work at Success Capital, we had been working on climate issues in 2015 and we didn't know that, it was a thing. Up until, obviously we found so many, young people who were taking action and, they were actually driving all these, the variant climate strikes. And now my question really is around, going back to that first question about visibility, and then within the context now of knowing full well that we're in a very capitalist and economically driven world. I mean, that's why lockdowns are changing and the adjustments to regulations because of economic, not because of, bringing dignity to African lives, right? Now my real challenge is, in as much as we have recognized and acknowledged Africa's demarcated Lusophone and, borders and so forth. We know in our history that Africa did not have those borders. We know in our ideologies, in our cultural practices, in our belief systems, as diverse and variant as they are, they were still quite systemic. They were driven off of the premise of Ubuntu and Boto. We understood what Nguni meant, and it wasn't limited to a specific ethnic group or a specific location. But now in this world where, it obviously, knowing full well that our history is orally passed down to us, and in a world where documenting and evidence, and we speak about it so highly, in a way that we don't actually sit down and ask ourselves, all these analyst predictions, all these, financial ratings, off of predictions of policy changes and political dynamics in country, and even just off of the fact that, in Africa, it might be unacceptable to have more than 2 consecutive terms as president or head of state. But in some other, regions, we've had people who've basically been head of state or who've, steered countries for almost 2 decades, and it has been palatable. There's some countries that don't have constitutions written, yet, there's such a huge insistence on, legal precedents, jurisprudence, and, documenting our constitution in a way that is palatable to investors. So, we're still always appealing to this other audience somewhere, even though we just feel like, okay, yes, the fourth estate is now finally, highlighting our issues. But we're still realizing that there's certain voices that don't have as much weight or merit. There's so much research that's being carried out on the global south, and this usually is led by those that are in the global north, another demarcation.
Yeah.
And then you're finding even those global south, writers are very adamant on trying to produce or reproduce whatever content is there in the global north, because then there's an assumption that it would be credible. Meanwhile, you're finding the entire world is studying the global south. So I think there's so much power in South cooperation. There's so much power in how gender diverse bodies were idolized and were revered in historical cultures in the global south. And that is universal. But there's still a certain level of merit, there's still a certain level of acceptability and recognition and visibility that is granted to certain demographics when it's politically salient. And I say this knowing full well that, we've had protests in Hong Kong, which is like a bit of a commemoration since then, as it's been a year. We've had, significant movements that have literally changed the way we've thought about so many issues, and we've learned from them. But for some reason, you still need something that will then say, oh, right, you're credible and you won't be invalidated, or we won't gaslight you anymore, or we won't question you anymore. And I don't know if that is human nature or it has to do with privilege, because privilege allows for exercising options, which means you have a plethora available to you. So you'd rather select first class, you'd rather select, or rather quote or cite, the Global North writer or whatever it is, because, they're backed by a larger institution, or because they're using a certain form of referencing that is acceptable to you. So how do we then safeguard credibility, knowing full well, even if we speak the language, even if we get educated the same way, even if we affirm their version of history, we're still not good enough. We still don't find ourselves fitting in. We still find ourselves, it's like someone giving you, okay, well, I mean, you can use both hands, but just know that, the other hand can't really fully function because it happens to be left, right? So there's an ableism there's a certain level of erasure, because now we must, fit ourselves into certain M&E indicators. We must fit ourselves into certain SDG frameworks, for instance. So how then do we sort of safeguard our credibility, in essence, our humanity, our multifaceted, dynamic resilience, beauty, and diversity as individuals in a way that can be impactful in spite of this like huge hurdle of palatability to those who have power and resources?
Oh. Hey, Banna.
Sorry, I'm actually now putting my thoughts. These are like my daily thoughts, and I'm hoping you can help.
No, I mean, I'm really energized by this conversation, and you're giving me so much to think about and to learn as well. And again, I'll start by saying, for me, it's been an iterative process, and I want to reflect on myself as an individual, also now as a rapid response mechanism grant lead, right, at an organization, an INGO. And I always say this to a friend of ours that Dumi and I share my way to, that my work of resisting the patriarchy in organizations has been radical kindness and frankness. And and being able to be vulnerable in the workspace, because I view the workspace as intimately a part of my poesis. I know, for example, that Angela Davis writes extensively around not doing work that isn't a love work anymore, and how that's such a privilege, right? And I'm not yet in that privileged space where I can do a work that's not a love work, because what you're also asking me is how do we do this? How do we protect the sanctity of the work that we do? And there's a Greek word for it. It's called poesis, which is bringing into being and articulating something new about the world that builds the world. And I'm paraphrasing because I don't speak Greek and I don't like to quote European mythology, which is extracted from African mythology. That's another story for another day. But how do we do that love work and be visible and eat, right? Because that's the other thing that we need to do, is we need to eat as civil society actors. We have extensive care networks. Oftentimes these aren't about ourselves. They're also about our familial and non-blood familial connections, and supporting them and being able to build them and build a community that is well fed and able to tap into resources. I've done a study on the Black middle class in South Africa recently, which looks at race, class, and gender dynamics. And it shows extensively that there's so many actors in the Black middle class that I think I'm paraphrasing my own research. I don't know the number off by heart. About 60%, or at least half of the respondents were sending remittances home. And the unit of analysis in this case was the household, right, in economics. It is the household that is the unit of analysis. But the assumption is that the rural and the urban household are not connected. The connection between non-familial bonds are not resource connected, but they are. And in our current way of thinking and being, in our current framework of analysis, there is no acknowledgement for those ties beyond an economic analysis of remittances. And it's very hard to be radical and eat at the same time. And for me, as part of my learning, and part of my needing to feed this human who I chose to bring into this world, has been also acknowledging where I can safely be radical, and keeping receipts of my radicalness and using that very system to frame the injustices of how it works. But then also being open to being challenged and using the challenges that I receive, for example, in this position as focusing on a response grant, to then build network and solidarity with indigenous communities in Latin America, in the continent, in Kenya, for example, to build networks of resources between those who specifically fund LGBTI advocacy, where I cannot because of the restrictions placed on my grant, but making those ties far more closer than is currently comfortable, because the grant had been in existence for 10 years and it was fine that those connections were not so well articulated, that we weren't referring across the world, that our advocacy around these issues wasn't so pronounced. But for me, I think more importantly, in terms of visibility, is this radical work of kindness and love. I cannot work with a partner, regardless of their own, even working across the world. We get homophobia, we get extensive racist profiling and comments. I've been called a kafir in the Middle East for doing this work, even as someone who's giving resources. I've been told that someone wants to speak to the manager to get approval, even though I'm head of the grant, and still an excruciatingly painful process of love work. Oh my goodness, I love the work that I do. I love the people that I work with. I see them as people. I try and embody a kind and frank feminism so that you always know where you stand with me. You have no uncertainties about that. I don't know what that looks like beyond it. I think maybe lastly, and recognizing that the children are now all in the same room with me, all of them, have come out of the trenches and are looking at me. I'm still on a call. I'm almost done, honey. Is having resources and reaching out to the 30-day the NGBV protests last year, and saying, you know, we support protest movements. You don't need to be registered. You don't need to submit audit reports, but we can fund you. And them saying, actually, no, we don't need your money. You know? Yeah. And that was radical. My daughter finds that very funny as well. And that was radical because, again, you know, we need to eat, but also there's a power we have when we're not tied to these resources. And how do we systematize that distribution? For me, that has now looked like income distribution with the income I get personally, not just with my family or to NGOs, but to activists directly where I can. So how do we systematize those types of unconventional systems? I don't know. I don't know,
Yeah.
Dumi. I don't know, basically.
Yeah. You know, as you're elaborating, you know, and I was just thinking to myself, it is exhausting. It literally exhausting. And you know, I am reminded, you know, by what, and I hope I'm saying her name correctly, Séverine Gojo Granville. So this is from a Francophone Africa, and you know, she says that is one of the basic principles of decolonial ecology, placing value on different, often ancestral ways of inhabiting the world, which for me is really, you know, about love, working out of love. And
Yes.
she further goes on to say that, you know, which have been damaged by colonization, idealized, or turned into folklore. Decolonial thinking invites us to bring together local language with scientific and technological research, ever
Yeah.
more relevant for
Yeah.
COVID-19. And you
Yeah.
know, as you were speaking, I also just want to now affirm, and I think it's really powerful that we need to do more of this. And I thank you for that because it should be a tool that I should be, you know, using more. You know, the words of Malaika Mahlasi, and you know, I
Yes.
really love how, you know, she really frames a lot of the things and expresses herself on social media. And you know, she said, you know, there's nothing more demeaning than having to perform poverty, to become a spectacle just because you are poor and received help. We helped you because we believe your story. And I think this is where love work comes in. It's really centered in decolonizing. It's really centered in acknowledging our history, not as it's documented, but as we know and as we've learned from our, you know, those generations that precede us, and as we have learned in terms of our own lived experiences in surviving some of these atrocities. And you know, I'm and this is a trigger warning for our listeners, but I think it's really also quite important because South Africa and Botswana are the two per thousand. I'm not sure of the statistic. I can always include that in the link. But you know, South Africa's first, then Botswana comes second with a per capita rate of the highest sexual offenses or sexual assault cases. And I think in, you know, a recent judgment that she had presented, she was just saying that, you know, although rape is defined as unlawful and an intentional act of penetration of one person and another without consent, it must be buttressed that the victim does not experience rape as being sexual at all. And it's really quite critical for me, you know, as she then sort of was expanding as well, she was saying, you know, they don't experience rape as a sexual encounter, but as a frightening, life-threatening attack, and as a moment of immense powerlessness and degradation. And you know, as I sort of read that consistently, because I've been reading it, you know, for quite some time, I must say, ever since it came out, and you know, in light of, you know, even just my own story and my own experiences, and you know, with how inequalities have been illuminated, I have seen the importance and of allowing myself to heal, to cry, and to do the kind of work that maybe I would have needed when I was much younger. But more importantly, is to sort of now acknowledge, you know, as per the judgment, that it is an abuse of power, that yes, although it is expressed in a sexual way, it is characterized with power on one side and disempowerment and degradation on the other. And this is how governance, this is how democracy, this is how those that we thought were acceptable forms of equality have played themselves out in emails, in funding decisions, in, who can speak at a conference, in, the fact that we preach to the choir, and the fact that, we have to exercise a certain level of decorum and acceptance, despite the cyclical violence that is psychologically, emotionally hemorrhaging of our bodies and experiences. And I'm now really, keen on us acknowledging and us naming at its core what this looks like: institutional racism, supremacy, patriarchy, abuses of power, and violence. There has never been, let me put it rather, there has never not been any form of violence when decisions are made. Even though we sit and say precautions of COVID, even though we sit and say, oh, it's the political dispensation that we've all been seeking for, despite the fact that our land and other dignities have been stripped of us, our history has been stripped of us, and in a very violent way. And, just to close, what are the three things that you think we must, what must we continue? What must we stop? And what must we start in light of all of this? And acknowledging our history, that we are individuals of resilience. We have survived and are still surviving so many different struggles, and they come in different shapes, inclusive of those that are legal, inclusive of those that are politically correct, and those that are a cultural fit in organizational frameworks. What should we start? What should we stop? And what should we continue to eliminate this violence, no matter how visible or invisible it is, in our history, our knowledge, what we produce, how we deploy resources, and our activism?
I mean, so thanks for that. Again, I'm also learning so much from you in this conversation, and I'm taking and it's sitting in my body quite deeply. Yeah, it's sitting almost as a ritualistic cleansing that I think I've needed for a long time. So I just want to honor what you've just said. What should we stop doing? And I reflect on this as a person who is also a survivor of sexual violence. 3 different instances over multiple years in my childhood, with a lot of violence of not just the bodily experience, but the grooming and the 3 different instances and the denial and the shame around that. And then I think for myself, making the commitment as I don't know if I can call myself an activist, but maybe I should say as an activist, to not be a site of re-traumatization, not only for myself, but for my child. So that's definitely something we should stop doing. And I don't know, we talk a lot about self-care, and, there's been a lot of conversations around resourcing psychosocial inputs to activists, but there really is something deeper around that, which is community care of love and holding, community care that allows not just the light, this obsession with the light within people and the light that they bring, but also the shadows that they bring, because we've lived deeply traumatic lives, and not just as individuals. Throughout our generations, we're carrying that trauma of our histories within our bodies and within our blood. And we bring that to our poesis, we bring that to our world of work and to our relationships. And then we continue this process of traumatizing and dehumanization in ways that are seen and unseen, not just for ourselves, but even for activists who we don't agree with, right? And so we break ourselves on one another because there's not sufficient self and community care. There's not sufficient space to be light and dark, right? This obsession with the superhero, right? And I love my daughter. She's turning 5 on Friday, and she's obsessed with villains, right? And I'm just like, brah, you can't be obsessed with villains, like. But I think from an early age, she's seen this complexity of the human character, that it's not just all good and it's not just all bad, right? And that for me has been such a learning, to be like, oh, well, what do you think about this villain, and how Mummy can sometimes be villainous, you know, and how Kiki can sometimes be villainous, and working out our collective trauma, because I know even as a parent who's doing a lot of work on myself, I'm traumatizing her, and making space for her if ever she needs to say, actually, I need to be away from you, then I can be like, okay. So she even just this morning, she just told me, you know, I just need a few minutes away from you. And that for me is really powerful, because those are the types of dynamics we need to see more in civil society. And amongst ourselves. And I'm not just talking about formal movements. I think of so many protest movements and activist movements that aren't formalized, that have been burnt not just externally by the classism, but by the re-traumatization and the reactivation of triggers that are deeply embedded in the work, because the work is in our bodies. We didn't come to this work because it was easy or glorious or to be famous. This was a calling for us, for a lot of us. We could have been accountants or lawyers, but here we are, you know, struggling. And so I really think we need to stop doing that. And I think what we need to do more of is exactly this, alternative thinking, alternative forms of resourcing ourselves, alternative allyships. Um, we need to stage a resistance, and we need to, you know, I remember the story of when Obama was in office, and every time the women would speak, they'd be overspoken by the men in the room. And so they started this process of amplification of points, right? So every woman would repeat it, like, yes, I agree with you, we should do this. And I wonder if a model like that for radical feminist futures could work within our advocacy, that when one person says this, we say yes, yes. And we've seen this in our work. Oftentimes, sometimes we're wrong, right? But oftentimes we're right. We're right, you know, about the pandemic and the effects of inequality and the violence of our institutions and the violence of doing this work and the pain and the trauma, and what we know what we need, because we are the ones we need. We are the ones we've been waiting for, right? To quote as well. And so what does amplification for that look like for us in our world of work? Because shifting narratives, and there's a lot of narrative work happening in the global north right now, and of course, by the time it filters down to the global south, it will all be based on these Western models. But we have the narratives within ourselves. We've been writing these stories. We've been telling this oral history. We've been passing it on in these conversations like I'm having with you, that make me feel like I've been gaslit like my whole life. And now it's like, oh my goodness, yes. There is a coherence that we share amongst ourselves. Um, and so before we start this revolution, because it is coming and it won't be televised and it won't be nicely packed into an op-ed in a peer-reviewed journal, it is coming. It is coming. People are tired. The bodies are tired. Can we, in the meanwhile, build our histories and our narratives with one another in the struggle?
Thank you so much, Masana. And I like, just to sort of close off, and I really thank you for that. I think it's really, really powerful. And you were just reminding me now, of how Winnie Madikizela once said, I am a living symbol of the white man's fear, and I never realized
Yes.
how deeply embedded this fear is until she got to Brantford. And I think it's really
Yes.
powerful. Even when we spoke about the love work, for me, it then rang, and it says, one of the greatest things that she feared was letting down her people. And, she wouldn't live with that kind of conscience and of letting down people after they've been brutalized for so long. And so these
Yes.
words I am echoing and empowering, as we're commemorating June 16, is that it's really, really critical. I know we've celebrated the man, but more importantly, someone who played a significant role for those 27 years that he sacrificed was Winnie Mandela. And and I think what's really powerful for me, especially as you're speaking, was how she said she's not ashamed of anything, which really echoes Stella Nyanzi, and that
Yes.
she's never been ashamed of anything that she's done in the name of fairness and justice for her people. So whether it is failing forward, whether it is being radical, and whether it's just changing the landscape, one thing for sure, I think even just from some of my work, I've just learned it is never about that audience that holds power. It is never about those who are policing bodies, thinking, and who are trying to silence our existence. And it is so much more about the individuals who are coming after us. It is so much more about those beautiful, powerful, resilient, and dynamic change agents who then get to that is where their power lies, is that it is possible to be that radical, it is possible to break those barriers, even if it just means it's challenging one person in a text, even if it means it's challenging a cyber bully, even if it means it's challenging someone who you should be comfortable with and next to. And so I really appreciate this conversation. It has been amazing. And in your words of love work, I would like to part with a last quote from Mamwini Madikizela, and that is, I'm not the sort of person to carry beautiful flowers and be an ornament to everyone. So in our beauty, in our light, in our darkness, that we can hold, occupy space, claim it, not just for ourselves, but those who might feel like they're alone in the world. And so thank you so much, Masana. I really, really appreciate this beautiful conversation. I am certain it is going to ruffle a few feathers, but more importantly, uh, so many of us out there. I think it's one for the history books, and I really, really, truly thank you for this conversation.
Thank you so much to me, and thank you for this beautiful work of building coherence for us, and I think you're centering again just also to quote some of the writing of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, is that the personal is inherently political for us. And I know within your personal and within your professional and within your love work that it is political, and that's part of a healing work that you're doing for so many of us. And it can't be easy, but thank you for that, and for even creating the space for such crucial and difficult conversations. I appreciate you so much.
That is Masana Ndinga. Amazing conversation. My name is Dumi. Thank you for listening.